The work of 3 years comes down to this. I am really passionate about this subject. I even stopped considering this project an assignment. I have chosen to center my dissertation around African American literature because words are indeed the most effective weapon to fight against political and social injustices. I started off with a brief history recap. When talking about the Atlantic slave trade, the topic is often discussed as something from the past, but we have to remember that slavery has very real implications on today's society. Many Harlem Renaissance authors, Zora Neale Hurston in particular, remind us that these horrors are in fact pretty recent. The last American slave ship sailed less than 200 years ago, in 1859 to be exact. Vera Kuhn tells the story of Cujo Lewis, an African man, part of the last human cargo to arrive on U.S. shores. The aim of my project is to prove that art, in this case literature, can bring people from similar backgrounds together. State leaders have always been well aware of this notion. In fact, education was made inaccessible to most African Americans, and still is, due to inadequate funding in primarily black neighborhoods. However, some individuals who were favored by extraordinary circumstances were able to write poetry and even become great poets and storytellers. In West African culture, griot storytellers were eminent figures in communities. Phyllis Wheatley was an author and a poet who wrote in the 18th century. She was harshly criticized by Thomas Jefferson, who refused to recognize her genius. In 1865, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was passed. The abolition was only formal though, because Jim Crow laws entered into force shortly after. There were state and local laws in place in most southern states that regulated every aspect of African American life. They were employed to circumvent the 13th Amendment. This generated even more discontent, but represented a common objective for black intellectuals. Among the most prominent of the time was W. E. B. Du Bois, the author and philosopher who postulated the theory of double consciousness. This theory holds that African Americans and all black people living in Western societies experience a constant inner struggle, given that they must reconcile their African identity with Western societies, which are inherently racist. Another intellectual who is worth mentioning is James Baldwin.
In his essay titled "The Fire Next Time", the author points out that the very same disdain towards the different and toxic sense of pride animate both nationalist Islamic religious groups and the black church, which he grew up in.
Beginning in the 1960s, we see a rise in militant forms of protest and art. In the wake of the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement and the figure of poet-activist emerge. Poetry and literature start merging themselves with other forms of art, such as theater and acting. This movement is at the core of hip-hop and conscious rap. Throughout American history, a variety of language generally spoken by African Americans emerged. African American Vernacular English, also known as AAVE, is a sister dialect of American English that began to diverge in the 18th and 19th century. This language variety has been repeatedly discredited, so much so that in 1996 the Oakland School Board, which proposed to use vernacular English in school settings, defined it as a language detached from English, with the same linguistic and communicative competencies as West African and Caribbean languages. This statement was widely misunderstood and used to justify the lack of integration in the education system, which persists to this day. African American culture is American culture. Its impact on current events and media is undeniable. It has been and will continue to be able to innovate, advocate, and fight against any kind of definition from outside.